of them touches you, you're dead. Green dead.
The real thing. Move.
So did you think the post-apocalyptic movie started with Mad Max? Think again. We are here to talk about A Boy and His Dog, a 1975 movie based on a novella and is directed and co-written by L.Q. Jones. And this one stars Don Johnson before his Miami Vice days as Vic. And this is a strange post-apocalyptic environment. It's also known as Apocalypse 2024, and as you can probably guess from that title, it takes place in the year 2024, and it's after World War IV, where the majority of the human race has been destroyed, and what we are left with is essentially the ragtag survivors, and it focuses on Vic, played by Don Johnson, who is essentially just a kind of a scavenger looking to survive, and he has this dog. Now, he actually has a kind of psychic connection to this dog, and it appears that dogs in this world have been modified to be able to communicate psychically with, people, and this one is kind of his kind of partner, and essentially the goal of these two, this dog and and John Johnson's character Vic, is to go around, find food and rape women. Yes, rape women. This maybe not have aged particularly well, you might be saying. Anyway, the pair of them meet this woman who seems to be more than a little bit willing to kind of cooperate, but that of course leads to further adventures. Okay, so let's talk about what works in this movie. So this 1975 movie, this is somewhat typical of a 70s movie in its tone. I remember there was a joke on The Family Guy saying about kind of 1970s sci-fi movies and how they're all very kind of depressing. And this is true of this film in a lot of ways. It has quite a nihilistic kind of viewpoint and is certainly not a fun movie per se, although it does have some very bizarre and surreal elements to it. But it's certainly kind of like not what you would call a fun film. It's based on a kind of a novella, as I say, although there have been a few changes. What can I say that works in this film? It's it's surprising to see a kind of like, I think like I've said, but a lot of people would think Mad Max was the kind of like the pioneer of this kind of style movie, but this obviously is obviously quite influential on that series, and apparently is very influential on the Fallout games. Obviously you have the kind of the boy and the dog situation in this film as you do in those games. So, it is somewhat of a seminal film in some respects, and introduces lots of kind of like interesting ideas. One of the things that I liked about this movie are how things are just there, and you just have to accept that they're part of this world. For example, and then some of this stuff I think is expanded upon in the novellas and stuff, but the psychic link between Don Johnson's character and his dog, it's kind of there. It's not really explained in the film. You just have to accept that is the part of this world. Also, the kind of like the hunt. There seems to be very few women, and essentially all the kind of the men that are left are just kind of like trying to hunt down and ultimately rape and kill women. And we see one happen like this at the beginning of the film. And there's also these we have these things called the screamers, which are the kind of like the really badly affected people by radiation that kind of glow, and we don't even see them, but they're kind of the presence is felt just because people talk about them and are very afraid of them. So there's lots of things here that we have this kind of like this lived-in world, so to speak, and stuff is referred to that we kind of don't see. So you do feel here that the movie does do a good job in, I think, world building, giving you the flavour of this world without having to kind of like show you everything. It's kind of like, I think it's quite good at that. And also, I think the movie is filmed incredibly well, because you really just do feel like these people have just been driven mad by, obviously, the apocalypse and things like that, and are now really, you just can't reason with them. And there's kind of like, there's just nice little touches, for example, where education has slipped. So, Don Johnson trades some food to get something, and it's actually a can of beetroot, but the guy can't read it, so he tells him it's a can of peaches and things like this. Nice little touches here and there that I think just kind of adds to the kind of the movie. Now, this is not necessarily a good thing, but Don Johnson's character is very unlike most leading men. As I say, he actually wants to go out and rape women. That's what he wants to do. Now, apparently, and I haven't read the novellas, but apparently that wasn't quite as misogynistic in the novella, and it was criticised when this film came out and ultimately became quite controversial. And that was in the 70s. So you can imagine now that this movie really hasn't aged well in having this kind of like this, our main character, our protagonist, who is quite happy to go and rape people. And it actually, it's not like that he hasn't done it before. There's actually a line of dialogue where he says he hadn't had sex in like a couple of months or something like that. And he's also meant to be 15. So it's quite kind of like, oof, it's a little bit kind of uncomfortable watching in 2021, because obviously even in the 70s it was considered controversial, but now it really is. So that was kind of a bit of an interesting one. So I remember watching this movie when I was a kid and quite enjoying it, but I have to say, if I'm honest now, there's not a lot to the film in some ways. You don't really feel the movie goes anywhere. Now, the movie has two distinct parts. The first two acts are Don Johnson's character, Vic, and Blood the dog, out in the kind of the wilderness and kind of dodging raiders, dodging the screamers, trying to kind of find a particular woman. The last act is where they go to this kind of like community that lives underground. And they're like really bizarre, this kind of bizarre community who all kind of dress up like the Joker and have some, they want Don Johnson for something specific, which I won't kind of reveal for you. And that is very distinctly different. So it's kind of darkly comedic in some ways, but if you're looking for a kind of, an interesting plot, I think the plot here has some interesting elements within it. But the actual narrative of our characters and the journey that these characters go on is fairly kind of vague and kind of not a lot really happens in a lot of ways. A lot of this movie is Don Johnson talking to a dog. And the dog kind of like, we hear what the dog is saying through kind of narration, and that's obviously what Don Johnson's character is kind of meant to be kind of psychically hearing. But there's a hell of a lot of it. It's just a hell of a lot of kind of like incidental kind of conversation between Vic and Blood, and not a huge amount of driving the kind of the plot forward, really. Now, again, this is the 1975 movie, so it is of its time in regards to kind of the pacing. They weren't particularly fast-moving movies back then, but nonetheless, it's surprising how little actually happens in regards to meaningful kind of plot development within the actual film itself. And as I've mentioned, Don Johnson's character is somewhat unlikable. Obviously, the whole kind of the rapist thing is obviously one thing, but he seems to be constantly kind of aggressive towards Blood, the dog, and pretty much anyone who he comes across. And it's a pretty unlikable character in kind of many ways. The third act as well is so different from the first two, it's surprisingly jarring, and it ultimately, I think, is less interesting than the kind of the first two acts of the film. It's almost its own little film in a weird way. So I actually remember liking this movie when I was young, but watching it now, I have to say it's an interesting film. It's an interesting film to watch, but I don't know if I think it's a particularly good movie in some respects. I think it's just a little bit dull, a little bit nihilistic, with not a lot of real story in there, but just filled with some interesting moments within that. And ultimately, a very unlikable lead character. And I've got to be honest, I think the acting isn't particularly good in this movie. I'm going to give this one a 5 out of 10, because I do think despite the fact this has some real bad weak points, it still is somewhat pioneering for its time at least. So it's a 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.